there's a virus that hits the country. It's not cataclysmic, it's like a bad flu. And so people are getting sick, it's not clear why, and therefore you've got this information vacuum into which the fake news is getting sucked. And there are all kinds of terrorism rumors, both about the shortage of Dormagen and about the virus. Even as the president and staff were squashing the terrorism rumors at every turn, Perez was finding that the Latino separatist angle had legs. So we'll get to what he's... So ethnic tensions had been simmering in the country long enough that any story positing an Anglo-Hispanic rift with a political conspiracy thrown in was bound to get clicks. Now, mind you, this is mostly written in 2016.
Yeah.
There are a fair number of things that are unfortunately satire in the book, some of which have actually come true. There is a scene where, in a fit of pique, the president takes away the Speaker of the House's plane. That's just happened. So things that I thought were imaginative in his fourth post of the day, Perez fed the story, a term he described as adding just enough new detail to get the original readers to come back while attracting new ones. He did so with a bombshell revelation. The likely first president of the Estado Latino Nuevo, which is this new breakaway Hispanic republic in the southwest of the United States, was going to be the Speaker of the House, according to sources close to the Speaker. The Speaker summoned reporters to the Capitol, expecting them to bask in the glow of her leadership. She had prepared short remarks blasting the president for turning over America's health to greedy corporations. Dormagen is made by a private company, so that becomes a whole. She had rehearsed fulsome pledges to explore every option for managing the crisis, but she would never get that far. Not long after the Speaker said good afternoon, reporters began yelling questions about Latino separatism. CNN's top political reporter shouted over the din, "Have you accepted the offer to become the president of the Estado Latino Nuevo?" The question was ridiculous, but devilishly so, as the layers of falsehood embedded within it were guaranteed to throw the Speaker on the defensive. No one in the mainstream media gave any credence whatsoever to the separatist story, let alone that the Speaker would be the leader of the breakaway Latino Republic. But the Capitol Hill reporters were clever enough to recognize the Speaker's political ambitions. The press conference was a solid signal that she was trying to build a reputation beyond the Beltway. The strategist, who's kind of the president's top strategy guy, was not the only one who saw this as the beginning of her presidential campaign. The assembled members of the press did not really want to know if the Speaker of the House was cavorting with Hispanic separatists. What they wanted to find out was how she would react when the accusation was leveled against her. "That report is absolutely false," the Speaker said emphatically. "Did you turn the offer down?" the CNN reporter followed up. "There was no offer," the Speaker said. A grizzled male reporter yelled from the back, "Would you consider such an offer?" CNN and most other stations were covering, and so it's kind of backstory. She has built a career as a Latina small business person, but she was raised in Greenwich, Connecticut, and her grandfather had emigrated from Colombia and was an appellate justice. So she had changed her name, and she had bought a chain of health food stores. So she was arguably neither Latina nor a small business owner, but it played very well. And so everybody's kind of sensing this blood in the water. CNN and most other stations were covering the Speaker's press availability live, anticipating the drama. The president, the strategist, and several other senior staff watched in the conference room on Air Force One. So for reasons that have a lot to do with the story, they are headed towards Australia, but then have to come back. So they spent a lot of the time in the air. A female reporter for Telemundo asked, "Would you support a separate state for America's Latino population if the region were to secede?" The Speaker ignored the question. She said, "The reports of any terrorist attack, domestic otherwise, are entirely false. The whole notion of some breakaway Latino nation is completely ludicrous." A BBC reporter asked loudly, "Would you still consider yourself the most important voice for America's huge block of Hispanic voters?" The question was reasonable, but it tossed the Speaker into more difficult terrain, as she now had to walk a fine line between dismissing the Latino Republic story and protecting a political career built on identity politics. "My job is to represent all Americans," the Speaker said. "Well, that's not technically true," the BBC reporter challenged. "You were elected in a congressional district that's predominantly Hispanic, and the Democrats who installed you as Speaker have made repeated attempts to single out Hispanic voters. I speak for all Americans." The BBC reporter was dogged. "You have repeatedly emphasized that American Hispanics are different, apart. How does that not create fault lines in the nation?" The Speaker said dismissively, "I think that characterization is entirely wrong. Well, you gave the first 10 minutes of your speech at the Democratic National Convention in Spanish, the BBC reporter said, prompting loud laughter from his media colleagues. On Air Force One, the strategist looked at his watch. Wow, 5 minutes in and she's still digging out of the hole. The president added, she's finally learning she's not as clever as she thinks she is. The speaker changed the subject. Here's what's important. Americans need to understand that there is no terrorist attack, none. Not domestic, not international. This is a common virus that has turned potentially deadly, and we are seeking to understand that. In the meantime, I am working aggressively with the administration to solicit Dormagen commitments from around the world. I am confident we can manage the crisis without loss of life. And what they've done logically is when the Dormagen's running out, they go to their allies, because this is a localized shortage, and they start asking for Dormagen commitments. So the traditional allies, Canada, the Europeans, give as much as they can, but the virus may also be hitting them. So there's a constraint, and also this is 10 years in the future. There is some animosity that has been built up between the United States and its traditional allies. The House Speaker took one more question. Her presidential hopes may have survived, but for that last question. An NPR reporter asked, the Chinese ambassador will be speaking shortly about the outbreak. The expectation is that Beijing will offer the U.S. enough Dormagen to cover our shortfall in exchange for diplomatic concessions, perhaps scrapping the South China Sea Agreement. Could you please comment on it? And in fact, what has happened is the Chinese government has said, we will give you whatever you want. There are just some small things that we're going to ask. And it effectively asked the United States withdraw all of its forces from East Asia and commit to Chinese hegemony in the South China Sea. In fact, the reason the president is going to Australia is to sign an agreement with allies in the region to protect against that. So China has exploited this. The speaker took a deep breath, nodding to acknowledge the importance of the question. Our number one priority right now is saving American lives, she began. If the Chinese government is offering assistance, we ought to take that offer very seriously. The comment seemed relatively anodyne in the moment. It felt entirely different when played over and over again, juxtaposed against the later remarks of the Chinese ambassador. Note to self, never say that an offer ought to be taken seriously before you have seen the offer. But that was still hours away. The House Speaker had more immediate headaches. As members of Congress arrived in Washington, they were in no mood to have her steer their deliberations, whether she was the leader of the chamber or not. Over on the Senate side, the majority leader, who's a funeral director from Illinois, for those of you who know our family, had been correct when he predicted that legislators would have to blow off some steam before any real business could get done. Even after America's political realignment, and remember, we're 10 or 12 years in the future, with the splitting of the Republicans into the New Republicans and the Tea Party, and the president's election as an independent, so this is our first independent president since George Washington, the political parties were still basically tribal. The first imperative was to support one's tribe and bash the other. This had two immediate implications. First, the president, having been elected as an independent, had no tribe. Members of Congress, left, right, and center, heaped abuse on every aspect of the president's existence, from his CEO wife. She had run Kraft Foods. And she was responsible for the mac and cheese massacre, which was a major layoff, which has somehow led to the Centera fraud, to Air Force One flying circles over the Pacific. That's kind of a long story. He had no legislative defenders. The Senate Majority Leader, the president's closest ally on Capitol Hill, did not pile onto the abuse, but he did not stop it either. At one point, he stepped out of the Senate chamber to call the chief of staff to reassure her that tempers would soon cool. The paradox is that for all the venom heaped on the president from every political direction, he remained significantly more popular than Congress, both during and after the outbreak. His address that morning had gone a long way towards insulating him from congressional criticism, which was perceived rightly as petty and self-serving. I'll leave one section here, and this will be familiar too, sadly. The criticism itself was neatly organized along tribal lines, as if each political party were responding to a different crisis. Members of Congress seized on the outbreak to reinforce their pre-existing political beliefs. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party hammered away at the Centera fraud, that's the company that committed accounting fraud, which led to the shortage, accusing the president of privatizing American government. The outbreak offered one more bullet to fire at corporate greed. The warehouse fire that made the Centera Dormigen necessary got nary a mention, nor did the inconvenient fact that Dormigen had been invented, $1.5 billion in private research and development spending, by the greedy private sector they were now blaming for a shortage of Dormigen. The Tea Party, ostensibly reacting to the same crisis, blasted yet, quote, another example of extreme government incompetence. The government had fumbled its responsibility to keep the American people safe. By this logic, responsibility for the outbreak lay with government bureaucrats who had failed to offer adequate oversight. It was time, the Tea Party leaders opined, for government to get out of the drug business entirely. No one took the remarks seriously enough to ask if getting out of the drug business entirely included eliminating the patent protection at the heart of all private investment in the pharmaceutical industry. The Tea Party proposed additional tax cuts, which would somehow induce the private sector to fix this problem that government had created. All right, so it goes on, there's more stuff, but essentially we're in a crisis. They're trying to figure out what to do about the shortage and how to balance. In a couple hours in the book, the Chinese government will make their announcement publicly. They on live TV as to what they're asking. It's a fairly draconian ask, and that leaves the government and the president, our protagonists, who you don't, this is all told in the first person, is a relatively recent Dartmouth grad who has become a scientist and is the expert on the virus.